Hey y'all, Nico here. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, thanks for joining me. I'm Nico. Today's video is a quick tutorial on how to incorporate props into your practice. I have several different props here, and I'm just going to give you a couple tips on how to use them to better get into yoga postures. So I have a pillow here, a yoga strap, a blanket, yoga blocks, and a bolster. And these props are used in various different ways in practices. Sometimes people are leery about using props because they think that that means they aren't good enough in their yoga practice. And that is a myth. People use props at all levels of their practice to get into certain postures. Your body just may have an anatomy where you can't necessarily get into a posture comfortably. So the props just help you to get into the postures a little bit easier. So I'm going to kind of go through each prop and just give short examples on how they're used or how to incorporate them. So let's start with a yoga blanket. Pretty easy. This isn't necessarily a yoga blanket per se. You can get blankets that are specifically for yoga, but this blanket is just this little quilted blanket I found at the thrift store a while ago. And so I just like to fold it up for when I need to use it as a prop. So when you're using a blanket, one of my favorite things to do is if I need some extra cushion underneath my knees, I can fold my blanket up and put it underneath my knees. So say you are in a table position or something similar. Blankets are great to use as cushion underneath your knees. Blankets are also great for using underneath your hips. So say that I'm sitting back in a kneeling pose. I can use my blanket and put it underneath my hips if my hips don't quite reach my heels, or if I just need a little more support to take some pressure off of my knees. You can also use your blanket to sit on. So say that you have tight hips and that you have a problem sitting in easy pose or sukhasana. A blanket can provide a little bit more support underneath your hips to open your hips up. And a pillow can be used in similar ways as well. So, for example, you can take the pillow instead of the blanket and put it underneath your hips for support. Or a couple pillows, a few pillows. You can use a bolster as well. You can use a pillow underneath your hips. Same thing as we mentioned before. Or another good example is child's pose. Sometimes people have issues bringing their hips all the way back towards their heels in child's pose. So you can take your blanket or your pillow, put it underneath your hips for a little more support. Or say you need support under your knees and behind your hips. You can put the blanket underneath your knees, the pillow underneath your hips, whatever you need to do. And this is why props are great, because they make so many poses accessible if you have difficulty. A pillow can also just be used as a pillow underneath your head in Shavasana. You can always use your blanket to cover your body up in Shavasana. So if you're just trying to get comfortable in your Shavasana, you can lay your blanket out over your body at the end of the practice. Have your pillow behind you and just make yourself comfortable so you can relax. So those are a few ways that you can use pillows and blankets. So for support underneath the hips, support underneath your knees, pillows and blankets are great. Now let's move on to the yoga strap. So the yoga strap essentially can just make your arms a little bit longer in a way. So say that I am in a seated forward fold and my hands don't quite reach my feet and I want to create a little resistance, I can take both ends of my strap and bring my strap around my feet and use my strap to make my limbs a little bit longer. So now I can have that push and pull motion using my strap, pulling my strap towards me. My feet are kind of pushing the strap away. So it's almost just as if it's making your legs a little bit longer. Straps are great for when you're trying to reach your feet with your hands. Another example, a lot of yoga straps, they have this little loop on the end. These little loops, little belt loops on the end. So you can use them to make a loop, to bring it around your foot or your feet. So say I am laying on my back and I'm doing a pose, hand to big toe or something like that, hand to foot pose. So if my hand doesn't quite reach my foot, I can make a loop around my foot, grab the strap, and just walk my hands up the strap. That'll just make my limbs a little bit longer and help me get into the posture better. You can also use a strap in a standing position. So say you wanted to use it for dancer pose or something similar. And again, you can use that loop around your foot. And say I wanted to use it for dancer pose. I'm grabbing the long part of the strap. My arm extends up, and this just makes my arm a little bit longer. So if my hand can't quite reach my foot, the strap helps you out. Let's move our strap to the side. And next I'll talk about yoga blocks. So yoga blocks also can help your limbs to be a little longer. And I like to use yoga blocks or suggest yoga blocks for standing postures. And they're also good for support underneath the hips too, if you need them. So let's start with that. So let's come back to this kneeling pose again. See, I'm in this kneeling pose. I need some more support. I can take one block and put it underneath my hips. Now I have something to sit on, give me a little bit of support here, or I can use both, make it even taller, make it a little more comfortable here. Another great use for a block as support underneath the hips is in Malasana squat. So for Malasana squat, we usually try to keep our feet flat. And what happens with a lot of people is once they come down low, their heels come up, or they're just not comfortable at all in Malasana. So you can use your block, set it on its tallest side, rest your hips down on the block, elbows inside of knees, and my feet are flat. And what's great about blocks is they have 3 levels. So you have a short side, a medium side, and a tall side. So you can kind of adjust it to your needs. Well, let me give you an example in a standing posture. You can use blocks underneath your hands in a forward fold. So I have them on their tallest side now, but maybe you don't need them that tall. Hands can come down to the shortest side. And of course the medium side as well. Another great use for blocks is, say you are in a triangle pose. I'll bring the block inside of my foot. So I want my hand to rest on the block. So it's just giving me a little more support. It can be on its lowest side, its medium side, or its tallest side. And again, it just gives your limbs a few extra inches so you can better get into those postures. Blocks can also be used to make your practice a little more challenging if you want to. You can do things like come to chair pose and hold a block in between your knees. So I'll hold the block in between my knees. Sweep my arms up, sit my hips back. Again, just for a little bit of a challenge. Or I like to use my blocks to challenge me in balancing postures. So things like this, bringing your weight onto the blocks. Postures like these, just to give you a few more inches. Sometimes that's harder when your hands are flat down on the ground, but blocks can help you out there. And another favorite use of mine for a block is in bridge pose. So say I'm on my back, bridge pose, you lift your hips up. You can always use your block as support underneath the hips. So you can bring it underneath the sacrum, resting the hips there. And again, it just gives you a little more support underneath the hips. And one more favorite I'll show you is pigeon pose with your block. So we're on all fours. For pigeon pose, you have one knee forward, other leg back. And a problem people tend to have is this space underneath the hips. So people sometimes are up really high. So you can take your block, bring it underneath your hips as some support. So blocks are great for being used to fill in space, whether it be underneath your hips, underneath your hands, to make your limbs a little bit longer. Just make sure you play around and see how blocks can support you. And so the last thing I have here is a bolster. Bolsters aren't necessarily used in your everyday yoga practice. Sometimes they're more so used for restorative practices. So when you see restorative practices online, or when you hear about restorative practices, there are many classes where they use a bunch of different props, and a bolster is one of those props. So bolsters are just another way to support you. So one of my favorite things with the bolster is child's pose with the bolster. So you have the bolster in between your legs, and you just come to rest on the bolster. Arms usually just rest on either side. Bolsters are also great for practices where you are leaning back, or for poses where you are leaning back. So you can put the bolster behind you. Say you are coming to a reclined hero pose. So you're in a kneeling position. You scoot the bolster close to your hips, and you can relax back onto the bolster. This is really nice. Provides a whole lot of support here, and it also helps to make the posture a little bit more relaxing. And then one more thing I like to do with the bolster is use it underneath the knees in Shavasana. So sometimes people laying flat on their back is hard because you may have space in between your lower back and the floor, or for whatever reason, laying flat on your back may be difficult. Your bolster can be used underneath your knees as you relax back. And it just helps the pose be a little more relaxing and helps your lower back be a little bit closer to the floor too, so you don't have that big arch and any pain there. So these are a few different ways you can use yoga props. Just be sure to play around with your practice and see how you can use props if you have difficulty getting into certain postures. And don't worry if you don't have all of these things at home. There are ways that you can substitute different objects for these props. So for example, if you don't have blocks at home, you can grab a couple books. If you don't have a yoga strap, you can use a belt, or if you have any long skinny piece of fabric, you can use it. You don't have to have a specific yoga blanket. You can use a regular blanket. And of course, you can use any pillows that are laying around. If you don't have a bolster, you can take a few pillows or a couple of pillows. I've done this before, taking a couple of pillows and kind of wrap them up in my blanket, making a makeshift bolster. That works just fine. Or if you have one of those long body pillows, you can wrap it up in a blanket. If you don't have these props at home, it's not a big deal. You can modify, you can get creative, and you can use different objects to help you out. It's totally okay to use what you have. You don't have to go out and buy a bunch of stuff, especially if you can't afford it. We just make things work the best we can. So I hope this helped you and give you a little bit of insight on how to incorporate props into your practice. If there is something in particular you'd like to know about using props, or a specific pose you'd like to know how to modify using props, leave a comment down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching. Peace and love.